7-year-old Sophie hadn't spoken since her mother's death 2 years ago. Robert Hartwell stood at his study window watching his daughter drift through the garden like a ghost. She moved between bare rose bushes and frost-covered paths, her small figure wrapped in a navy coat too expensive to comfort her. The March morning was cold. The grounds were perfect. His daughter was silent. Behind him, specialist reports covered his mahogany desk. Dr. Morrison from Boston, Dr. Chen from San Francisco, the European woman whose credentials filled 2 pages. All had examined Sophie. All had tried their methods. None had reached her. Robert pressed his palm against the window glass. The cold bit through his skin. Sophie had stopped at the garden gate again. She did this every day now, standing at the wrought iron barrier that separated their manicured estate from the street beyond. Her fingers touched the bars. Her face turned outward, looking at a world she no longer spoke to. The gate had been commissioned from Philadelphia, installed when Sophie was 3 and her mother was alive. Mary had loved that gate. She'd planted climbing roses meant to cover it by summer. The roses never grew. Mary never saw another summer. Robert turned from the window. He couldn't watch anymore. The breakfast tray sat untouched on the hall table outside Sophie's room. The music room where she'd once sung was locked. The drawing room where Mary had read to her each evening held furniture draped in white sheets. The house was a mausoleum. His daughter was its last living ghost. He'd tried everything money could buy. Private doctors, experimental treatments, a woman from Vienna who specialized in childhood trauma. They'd poked and prodded and prescribed. They'd used kind voices and stern methods and everything between. Sophie had sat through it all, silent and patient. Those dark eyes watching them with something too old for 7 years. Nothing worked. Nothing reached her. Robert sat at his desk and picked up Morrison's latest report. The child has retreated into selective mutism as a grief response. Time and patience are the only remedies. Do not force speech. Do not show frustration. Simply love her and wait. He'd been waiting 2 years. How long did patience require through the window? Sophie remained at the gate, but now she wasn't alone. A shadow moved beyond the bars, something shifting on the sidewalk outside. Sophie's head tilted. She leaned closer to the iron. Robert stood. Who was out there? Sophie pressed her face between 2 bars, looking down at something he couldn't see from this angle. Then she stepped back, stood very still, and watched. After a long moment, she turned and walked quickly toward the house. Robert moved to intercept her, but she'd already disappeared inside. He heard her light footsteps on the stairs. The shadow beyond the gate shifted again. Robert's jaw tightened. Tomorrow he'd instruct the groundskeeper to ensure the sidewalks were clear. His daughter didn't need vagrants lingering near their property. But that night, lying awake in the bedroom he'd once shared with Mary, Robert wondered why Sophie had looked almost curious for the first time in 2 years. Sophie woke before dawn. The house was still dark when she slipped from her bed and padded downstairs in her nightgown and bare feet. The kitchen was empty. Cook wouldn't arrive for another hour. Sophie knew this. She'd been watching routines for 2 years, learning the rhythms of a house that moved around her silence. She took a plate from the cabinet, bread from the box, jam from the larder, an apple from the bowl. She arranged everything carefully, the way her mother used to prepare breakfast on the veranda in summer. The back door opened silently. She'd learned which hinges creaked. Morning mist hung over the garden. Her feet left dark prints in the frost as she crossed the lawn toward the gate. The sky was turning gray at the edges. Not quite dawn, but no longer full night. The woman was still there. She lay against the exterior stone wall, wrapped in threadbare blankets the color of dirt. One arm pillowed her head. Her face was weathered. Maybe 50 years old. Maybe older. Her hair was gray and pulled back with a piece of string. Sophie stopped 3 feet from the gate. The woman's eyes opened. For a moment. They simply looked at each other, child and stranger. Wealth and poverty. Voice and silence. Then Sophie lifted the plate and pushed it through the bars. The woman sat up slowly. Her clothes were layers of mismatched fabrics, all worn thin. Her hands were rough but clean. She looked at the plate. She looked at Sophie. "Bless you, little one," she said quietly. Her voice was gentle, educated, surprising. Sophie nodded and sat down on her side of the gate. The iron bars separated them. The woman took the plate with careful hands and began to eat. She didn't gulp or grab. She ate like Mary used to eat, with small bites and quiet dignity. "This is very kind," the woman said between bites. "I'm Evelyn." Sophie watched her. Evelyn didn't seem to expect a response. She just ate the breakfast and made small comments about the morning. The birds beginning to sing, the promise of warmer weather eventually coming, when the plate was empty. Evelyn set it down carefully. "Thank you," she said. "That was the finest meal I've had in a long time." Sophie stood, retrieved the plate, and walked back toward the house. At the door, she turned. Evelyn had settled back against the wall, the blankets pulled close. She raised one hand in a small wave. Sophie almost smiled. Inside. She washed the plate and returned it to the cabinet. Then she went upstairs and dressed for the day, her heart beating a rhythm it hadn't felt since before, when the housekeeper found her missing from her room 20 minutes later. The alarm spread through the mansion like fire. Robert came running from his study. The groundskeeper was summoned. The gate was checked. Sophie was found in the breakfast room, eating toast with jam. "She was outside," Mrs. Wallace said, her face pale. "I saw frost on her slippers." Robert knelt before his daughter. "Sophie, where did you go?" She looked at him with those old eyes and said nothing. But she ate her breakfast completely, which she rarely did anymore. Robert checked the grounds himself. The gate was secure. The sidewalk beyond was empty, except for a pile of old blankets someone had abandoned against the wall. He ordered them removed, but when the groundskeeper went to collect them that afternoon, they were gone for a week. Sophie brought breakfast to the gate every morning. Robert didn't know at first. Mrs. Wallace discovered the pattern when she noticed the missing food and followed Sophie one dawn. The housekeeper reported it with wringing hands. "There's a vagrant woman, sir. She sleeps against our wall. The child has been feeding her." Robert's first instinct was immediate removal. His second was to watch first. So, the next morning, he positioned himself at the study window in darkness and waited. Just after dawn, Sophie appeared on the lawn with her careful plate. The woman, Evelyn. Mrs. Wallace had heard her called, was already awake, sitting with her back against the stone. Robert couldn't hear their conversation, but he saw Sophie sit, saw Evelyn eat with deliberate manners, saw the woman speak and Sophie listen. The child's face turned up with an attention she'd given no one in 2 years. They sat together for 20 minutes. Then Sophie returned inside. The pattern continued. Breakfast became blankets. Blankets became books from the library that Sophie carried down and slid through the bars. Evelyn accepted each gift with quiet thanks and never asked for more. Robert researched from a distance. He listened from windows. He noted Evelyn's speech educated, proper, surprisingly refined. Her clothes were rags, but her voice suggested she'd known better days. She spoke to Sophie about simple things. The robin building a nest in the elm, the shape of clouds, the way ice melted at different speeds in sun versus shade. She never pressed Sophie to speak. She simply talked, as if Sophie's silence was natural and required nothing. Robert found himself remembering Mary. His wife had read to Sophie every evening, spinning stories until their daughter's eyes grew heavy. Her voice had been gentle like that, patient, asking nothing but offering everything. Mary had died of influenza in 3 terrible days. Sophie had stopped speaking at the funeral and never started again. 2 years of doctors. 2 years of expensive failures and careful treatments that promised much and delivered nothing. Now this homeless woman achieved what specialists could not. Sophie smiled. Not often. Not broadly. But sometimes when Evelyn told a story, the corner of Sophie's mouth would lift. Robert sat at his desk one evening with Morrison's report open before him. Do not force speech. Simply love her and wait. Through the window, snow began falling. Sophie appeared on the lawn with a heavy quilt, the good one from the guest room. She pushed it through the bars. Evelyn wrapped it around her shoulders and pulled Sophie's hand through the gate. Holding it for just a moment, Robert set down the report. That night at dinner, Sophie ate her entire plate. Then she looked at Robert and smiled, genuinely smiled for the first time since Mary's death. He felt his throat tighten. Something was happening. Something beyond his control or understanding. He'd built an empire on control. He'd ordered his world through will and money and careful planning. But he couldn't order his daughter's heart back to life. Evelyn had done what he could not. The next morning, he left extra bread in the kitchen. He didn't say why. Cook didn't ask. But Sophie's breakfast offerings grew larger. Robert told himself this was temporary. He was monitoring the situation. He'd intervene if needed. But the first snow melted into the second. The second melted into March rain. Sophie kept visiting the gate. Evelyn kept accepting her gifts with dignity. And Robert kept watching, unable to stop what he couldn't understand. The point of no return had passed. He just didn't know it yet. Winter held on through March, but small signs of thaw appeared. Robert began leaving specific items where Sophie would find them: good bread, cheese, fruit meant for evening meals. He never acknowledged why. Sophie never asked. The food disappeared into her morning offerings. He watched Evelyn more carefully now. She never tried entering the property, never asked for money or shelter, never exploited Sophie's attention. She simply existed at the boundary, accepting what was given, offering quiet companionship in return. One morning, Robert positioned himself close enough to hear, "My daughter was about your age when she loved stories most," Evelyn said. She sat with her back against the wall, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. "I used to read to her every night." Sophie tilted her head, listening. Her favorite was about a rabbit who lost his way in the woods. He was very small and very scared, but he kept walking until he found his way home. His mother was waiting. Evelyn's voice caught slightly. She cleared her throat. "I had a husband once. A good man. He died when our daughter was 12. After that, things got hard, then harder. My daughter moved east for work. We lost touch. That was 20 years ago." She looked at Sophie through the bars. "But you know about losing people, don't you? Little one, I can see it in your eyes." Sophie's hand reached through the gate. Evelyn took it gently. Robert felt something crack inside his chest. This woman understood grief. She'd lived it, survived it, and somehow maintained grace through circumstances that would have broken him. That afternoon, his business partners arrived from the mill. Robert met them in the parlor, discussing contracts and production schedules. Through the window, he could see the garden gate. If they looked that direction, they'd see Evelyn against the wall. He angled his chair to block their view. The meeting ran long. When the men finally left, Robert stood at the window watching the empty street. Evelyn was gone. Probably to wherever she went when darkness fell. Sophie was upstairs, already in bed. That night, Robert lay awake thinking about a rabbit who lost his way, about a mother waiting, about a small girl who'd stopped speaking because the world had taken too much. Evelyn had lost more than most. She'd lost husband, home, daughter, security, everything. Yet she could still speak gently to a silent child and find beauty in a robin's nest. Robert had lost Mary. He'd nearly lost Sophie to silence. But he still had his home, his wealth, his perfect grounds. What had he done with any of it except build higher walls the next morning? He found Sophie laughing. Actually laughing, a sound he'd forgotten she could make. She stood at the gate while Evelyn told a story about a stubborn squirrel who'd stolen from her pack. Robert's throat tightened. When was the last time his daughter had laughed that afternoon? A telegram arrived from Boston. His sister Margaret was coming Friday to discuss Sophie's situation. Someone had written her about the vagrant at the gate. Robert read the telegram twice. Then he locked it in his desk drawer. Friday arrived too quickly. Margaret Hartwell Stevens swept into the house like a cold front. "Robert, what on earth are you thinking?" She didn't wait for greeting or tea. "A vagrant camping at your gate, with Sophie interacting with her. Have you lost your mind?" Robert stood in the parlor, watching his sister pace. She was 3 years older, fiercely proper, recently widowed herself but bearing it with rigid dignity. "Sophie enjoys the woman's company," he said carefully. "Sophie is 7 years old and traumatized. She doesn't know what's good for her. You do, or you should." Margaret moved to the window, saw Evelyn against the wall, and recoiled. "Good Lord! Robert!" She's still there, in full view of the street. What will people think? I don't particularly care what people think. Well, you should. You have a business to run, a reputation to maintain, a daughter to raise properly. She turned to face him. "Send her away, today. Gently if you must, but she cannot stay here." Robert felt his jaw tighten. Sophie has barely smiled in 2 years. That woman makes her smile. That woman is exploiting a damaged child. She's done nothing but sit there and accept Sophie's kindness. She's manipulating you. Don't you see first the child's sympathy, then yours? And soon she'll be asking for money or shelter or... She's asked for nothing. Margaret's face hardened. "Send her away. Robert, tonight, or I will." She left that evening on the late train, but not before ensuring the message was clear. Robert sat alone in his study, her words echoing. The house was silent. Sophie was asleep. At midnight, he made his decision. The next morning, he called his head of staff. "See that the woman at the gate finds alternative arrangements. Gently. Give her money for a boarding house. But she needs to move on." Mrs. Wallace nodded, her face carefully neutral. Robert returned to his study. He told himself it was the right choice, the responsible choice. Sophie would adjust. She'd adjusted to worse. But when he looked out the window an hour later, his world tilted. Sophie stood at the gate in her nightgown, tears streaming down her face. Silent sobs shook her small shoulders. Mrs. Wallace and the groundskeeper stood nearby. Frozen, Evelyn was gathering her belongings with quiet dignity. Sophie's hand gripped the iron bars so tightly her knuckles were white. Robert ran. He reached the gate as Sophie turned toward him. Her face was soaked with tears, the first she'd cried since Mary's funeral. Her mouth opened, but no sound came except broken breathing. She was trying to speak. Desperately trying. "Please, Papa." The words were barely a whisper, cracked and small, but they were words. After 2 years of silence, his daughter spoke. Robert's knees nearly buckled. "Please," Sophie whispered again. "Don't send her away." Evelyn stood very still, her belongings bundled. She met Robert's eyes with calm acceptance, asking nothing. Robert looked at his daughter's tears, at the woman who'd brought her back to life, at Mrs. Wallace and the groundskeeper waiting for orders. "Leave her be," he said quietly. Mrs. Wallace blinked. "Sir." "Leave her be. The arrangement continues." He knelt before Sophie and wiped her tears with his handkerchief. She threw her arms around his neck and sobbed into his shoulder, 2 years of grief finally breaking free. That night, Sophie fell asleep holding a small wooden bird Evelyn had carved from a scrap of oak. Robert sat beside her bed until her breathing deepened, then went to his study and poured whiskey he didn't drink. His daughter had spoken. 2 words. Barely audible, but words nonetheless. All it had cost was his pride. Margaret didn't give up. She sent letters first. Robert burned them. Then she orchestrated visits from people who mattered. William Thorne arrived on Tuesday, bank president, holder of mortgages on 2 of Robert's mills. They took coffee in the parlor. Thorne made pleasant conversation about production and markets and the spring construction season. Then, casually, "I heard you've taken in some charity work." Robert, admirable impulse. But you know how people talk. Eccentricity can be misunderstood in our line of work. Robert's hand tightened on his cup. "I'm not sure I follow." "Reputation affects trust. Trust affects credit. Just something to consider." Thorne left with a smile. The message was clear. On Thursday, Reverend Morrison called. He settled into the study chair with practiced ease and spoke about Christian charity and proper channels for helping the unfortunate. There are institutions. Robert, good places designed to care for people like that woman. Surely that would be more appropriate than this situation. Sophie has grown attached. Yes. Well, Morrison cleared his throat. Children often attach to inappropriate things. It's our duty as adults to guide them properly. After he left, Robert stood at the window. Sophie was reading to Evelyn through the bars, something about clouds. Evelyn listened with complete attention, as if a 7-year-old's observations were the most important thing in the world. Friday brought the heaviest blow. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper, the spring gala, the social event that mattered most in their circle. At the bottom, a handwritten note in Margaret's hand. "We trust you'll attend without complications. Appearances matter. Dear brother, for Sophie's future, if not your own." Robert stared at the word complications. That evening, he sat in his study with the invitation on his desk. Through the window, he watched Sophie show Evelyn her drawings, clumsy sketches of birds and trees. Evelyn praised each one with genuine delight. Warmth flowed between them, visible even from this distance. His daughter was alive again, speaking in whispers. Yes, but speaking, smiling, engaging with the world, all because of a homeless woman society wanted him to discard. Robert thought about the gala, the polite conversations, the careful questions about his situation, the subtle pressure to conform, to maintain appearances, to do what was expected. He thought about Sophie 2 years ago, silent and drifting like a ghost. He thought about Sophie now, whispering to Evelyn through the gate. The choice was simple. The cost was everything. Sunday morning arrived cold and gray. Margaret had returned for one final attempt. She insisted on attending church service with them, determined to restore Robert's respectability through visible piety. They walked together, Robert, Margaret, and Sophie. The congregation noticed their arrival. Whispers followed them to their pew. Robert felt the weight of every eye. Margaret sat with rigid posture, her message clear C. We're respectable, normal, no complications. After the service, the congregation gathered on the church steps. Margaret's social circle descended immediately the banker's wife, the mayor's sister, Mrs. Thornton, who controlled invitations to everything that mattered. So good to see Sophie out. Mrs. Thornton said. She smiled at the child. You look well. Dear. Sophie pressed against Robert's leg. I heard you've taken an interest in charity work. Robert, another woman said. Her tone was honey over ice. How progressive. Margaret forced a laugh. My brother has always had a compassionate heart. Sometimes too much so. Indeed, though one must be careful. People talk. Robert felt his jaw tighten. Sophie's hand found his. I'm sure Robert understands the importance of proper appearances, Mrs. Thornton said. She looked directly at him. Especially with a young daughter to consider. Future prospects and all. Margaret touched his arm. Of course he does. Robert looked at his sister. At the women with their knowing smiles and careful words. At Sophie. Small and silent, gripping his hand like a lifeline. He opened his mouth to agree, to placate, to maintain the peace. Then Sophie spoke. Her name is Evelyn. The words were soft but clear. Sophie looked up at Mrs. Thornton with steady eyes. The conversation stopped. Every person on the church steps turned to stare. Margaret's face went pale. "What did you say, dear?" Mrs. Thornton asked. "Her name is Evelyn. She's my friend." Robert's heart hammered. His daughter's voice was stronger now, gaining confidence with each word. Mrs. Thornton's smile tightened. "How? Lovely. I'm sure your father will ensure she's properly cared for, through appropriate channels." "She doesn't need channels," Sophie said. "She needs to stay." Margaret gripped Sophie's shoulder. "That's enough, darling. Let the adults talk." Sophie pulled free and looked directly at Robert. "Don't send her away. Papa, please." The congregation pressed closer, hungry for scandal. Robert could feel their judgment like physical weight. The banker's wife whispered to her neighbor. Reverend Morrison frowned from the church doorway. "Sophie," Margaret began. "She reads to me," Sophie said, her voice rising. "She listens. She makes me feel—" The child searched for words, her hands clenched into fists. "She makes me feel home." The final word broke. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop speaking. "Like Mama did. Before, when everything was good?" Margaret reached for her again. "Sophie, you're confused. This woman is not—" "She is." Robert felt the ground shift beneath him. Every face on those church steps showed shock, horror, fascination. This was scandal. This was social suicide. His daughter looked up at him with desperate hope. "Please, Papa, that's Mama." The words hung in the morning air. Margaret's face flushed crimson. Mrs. Thornton gasped. The congregation erupted in whispers. Robert knelt before his daughter. His knees hit the stone steps hard. "Sophie, do you understand what you're saying?" She nodded, tears streaming now. "She makes the silence stop hurting." Robert's throat closed. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her for the first time in 2 years. She wasn't silent anymore. She wasn't drifting. She was here, present, fighting for something that mattered. He stood slowly and turned to face the congregation, to face Margaret's fury and Mrs. Thornton's shock and the whispers that would follow him for years. "Then she's welcome in our home," he said quietly. "Permanently." The gasps turned to outright exclamations. Margaret grabbed his arm. "Robert, you can't be serious." "I'm entirely serious. You'll be ruined. Your business. Your reputation. Sophie's future." "My daughter is speaking again." Robert's voice was steady. "She's alive again. That's worth more than any reputation. You're making a terrible mistake." Robert looked at his sister, at the women who'd been his social circle, at Reverend Morrison shaking his head in the doorway. "Perhaps," he said, "but it's mine to make." He took Sophie's hand. She gripped it tight. Margaret's face twisted between fury and disbelief. "Don't expect me to support this madness." "I don't." Robert walked down the church steps with his daughter. The congregation parted like water. Whispers followed them to the street, but he didn't turn back. Sophie looked up at him. "You mean it, Papa. She can stay, I mean it, in the house." Robert's steps faltered. He'd been thinking of better arrangements for Evelyn, a cottage on the grounds. Perhaps. But Sophie's eyes were so hopeful. "Yes," he heard himself say, "in the house." Sophie's smile could have lit the darkest night. That evening, Robert walked to the garden gate alone. Evelyn sat against the wall, reading by lamplight a book Sophie had brought her. She looked up when his shadow fell across the page. "Mr. Hartwell." She stood, setting the book aside carefully. "My daughter calls you Mama," Robert said. Evelyn's face softened with sadness. I know. I've tried to discourage it, but... Don't! She blinked. Don't discourage it. Robert's hands were shaking. He clasped them behind his back. I'd like to offer you a room in the house, if you're willing. Evelyn stared at him. I don't pretend to understand what's happened here. Robert continued. I don't understand how you've reached my daughter when all my money and all my experts failed. But you have, and she needs you. Sir, I know what it will cost me, socially, professionally. I don't care anymore. Sophie spoke today, for the first time in public since her mother's death. She spoke. She fought for you. I can do no less. Evelyn's eyes glistened. I have nothing to offer in return. You've already given everything that matters. Robert unlocked the gate. The iron swung open on well-oiled hinges. He stepped aside. Will you come in? Evelyn looked at the open gate, at the mansion beyond, at Robert's outstretched hand. She picked up her few belongings and walked through. Spring arrived overnight, or so it seemed. Robert gave Evelyn the guest room on the second floor, modest but comfortable, with windows overlooking the garden. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, touching the door frame as if confirming its reality. It's too much, she whispered. It's a room. Robert said, You'll earn your keep helping with Sophie. But Evelyn did more than that. She helped in the kitchen. Despite Cook's protests, she mended clothes. She organized the library. She moved through the house like someone remembering how homes worked, what families felt like. And Sophie followed her everywhere, talking now in full sentences, making up for 2 years of silence. The social consequences came swiftly. Mrs. Thornton cut them at the market. The banker's wife turned her back when Robert greeted her. Invitations stopped arriving. Business associates made excuses to meet elsewhere. Margaret sent one final letter. You've destroyed yourself over a vagrant. Don't expect support from me. Robert burned it with the others, but some friendships held. Thomas Chen, whose mill supplied Robert's textiles, came to dinner and treated Evelyn with perfect courtesy. Dr. Morrison visited to check on Sophie and admitted he'd never seen such progress. Whatever you're doing, he told Robert, it's working. What they were doing was simple becoming a family. Mornings found them in the kitchen together, Sophie chattering about her dreams, Evelyn helping Cook prepare breakfast, Robert reading the paper while actually listening to his daughter's voice. The sound he'd thought lost forever now filled his house like music. Evenings brought story time in the library. Evelyn read while Sophie curled against her side. Robert sat in his chair, pretending to work while watching his daughter's face light up at the words. Sometimes Sophie fell asleep there. Evelyn would carry her upstairs, this woman who'd slept on streets now carrying his daughter to bed with tender care. One evening, Robert stopped Evelyn in the hallway. Why did you never ask for anything in all those weeks at the gate? You never once asked for help. Evelyn smiled slightly. Would you have given it if I'd asked? Probably not. Exactly. Sometimes grace only comes when we stop demanding it. She continued upstairs, leaving Robert standing in the hall with words he'd needed to hear. April brought new routines. Sophie started speaking in complete paragraphs, asking questions, laughing at jokes. She wanted to learn to read better, so Evelyn taught her. She wanted to learn to cook, so Cook taught them both. The house came alive in ways Robert hadn't realized it had died. Mrs. Wallace, initially scandalized, became Evelyn's fierce defender. When a tradesman made a snide comment about the charity case, the housekeeper banned him from the property. Miss Evelyn is family, she declared, and we don't tolerate disrespect toward family. One morning, Robert found Evelyn in the garden planting seeds. What are you doing? Your late wife's roses, she said. Sophie showed me where they were supposed to grow. I thought we might try again. Robert's throat tightened. They never took. Maybe they needed the right season. Maybe the ground needed time to heal. She pressed seeds into dark earth with gentle hands. Sophie knelt beside her. copying her movements. Robert watched them work, mother and daughter in all but blood, planting hope in ground that had been frozen for 2 years. That night, he stood at his study window looking at the garden gate. It stood open now, no longer locked. The iron barrier that once divided inside from outside had become just a threshold, swinging freely. Spring flowers bloomed where frost had been, green shoots pushed through dead earth. And in the house behind him, he heard Sophie's laughter and Evelyn's gentle voice reading stories. He'd lost his social circle, lost his sister's approval, lost the respect of people who measured worth by appearance, but he'd gained his daughter's voice, gained morning conversations and evening stories, gained a home instead of a mausoleum. Robert smiled and turned from the window. Some exchanges were worth making. The letter from Margaret arrived in late April. Robert almost threw it away unopened, but Sophie saw the Boston postmark and asked, "Is that from Aunt Margaret?" So he opened it. The contents were brief. "I don't understand your choice. But Sophie's laughter came through in your last telegram. Perhaps that's enough. Me. Not reconciliation. Not approval. But perhaps the first step toward acceptance." Robert showed it to Evelyn over morning coffee. She read it and smiled. "Family is complicated," she said, speaking from experience. "My daughter and I haven't spoken in 20 years, but I write her. Every month, I send a letter to her last address. They come back undelivered. But I keep writing. Because hope is cheaper than regret." Robert thought about that. Later, he wrote Margaret a real letter, not a telegram. He told her about Sophie's progress, about Evelyn's quiet grace, about learning that sometimes the most important things arrive in unexpected forms. He didn't know if she'd read it, but he mailed it anyway. Life settled into new rhythms. Sophie started attending a small school in town. Evelyn walked her there each morning and waited to bring her home, some mothers whispered. But others greeted Evelyn kindly. The school teacher, Miss Porter, sought her advice on reaching another silent child. "Whatever you did with Sophie," she said, "it was remarkable." "I just listened," Evelyn replied. "Sometimes that's enough." The roses began to grow. Tiny shoots at first, then stems, then the first hint of leaves. Sophie checked them daily, reporting progress to both Robert and Evelyn with scientific precision. "They're really growing, Papa." Robert looked. The roses were indeed growing, climbing the gate where Mary had imagined them years ago. Maybe the ground had needed time to heal. Maybe everything did. The social consequences lessened. Not everyone forgave his eccentricity, but some respected the results. Sophie's transformation was visible proof that unconventional choices could work. Even Reverend Morrison admitted, privately, that he judged too quickly. Business continued. The mills ran. Money flowed. Robert discovered he could survive without certain people's approval. One evening in early May, Thomas Chen came to dinner with his family. His wife spoke easily with Evelyn about gardening. His children played with Sophie without hesitation. Over dessert, Chen raised his glass. "To families we choose," he said, "and the courage to choose well." Robert met Evelyn's eyes across the table. She smiled. After dinner, he found himself in the garden watching sunset paint the sky. The gate stood open, roses beginning their climb toward full bloom. Sophie's laughter drifted from an upstairs window where Evelyn was reading her to sleep. Mrs. Wallace appeared at his elbow. "The house feels alive again." "Sir, like it did when the mistress was here." "Yes," Robert said quietly. "It does."